Yeah. Thank you so much for joining this evening. It's such it's so amazing to see so many of you. Of course, it's so nice to see Philip, but also Hannah, who is my very good friend, and all of you. And again, like I'm so amazed how many of you coming into this talk. It's such a nice day, and there's so many other good, nice things to do outside. But thank you so much for joining us. Just before we were talking about this today's seminar, one of us mentioned about Korean soap drama, and I was very intrigued by this word Korean soap drama because I have worked last year with Oxford English Dictionary, and we put the word K-drama in the dictionary. So, and then I talked with a few people that they were talking about K-drama, even not Korean drama, but K-drama. So I think it's sort of what we can see is very much the change, and we are in the sort of at the peak of the Korean wave, so-called K wave. It's also like very interesting in the looking at Oxford English Dictionary. Now actually the prefix K is now for the Korean culture exclusively. So I think it's sort of we are living in a very different time, and it's good for all of us who are interested in Korean culture. I lived here 20 years, and I think when I first arrived, it was sort of people talking about again Korean soap drama, or like not many interested in, and but I think now is the time when people can just talk about K-drama and knows what you're talking about. So yeah, it's a good time for us, all of us, and I hope it goes on for many years to come. So we and thank you so much, Loli, for making this wonderful, really nice image, the poster. Yeah, I don't know how many of you are watching or have watched Pachinko. I read the book, and it's so nice to see the book, and so English book, Korean book, and the Apple TV to kind of compare what is happening with in terms of a translational perspective. But yeah, and I strongly recommend you. But today I'm going to talk maybe first time we're just thinking about talking more about Pachinko, but then we thought maybe perhaps bring some more examples from for example, like Parasite and other the Squid Game and so on. So we'll bring some of the other examples, although we will have one or two examples from Pachinko. Yeah, and any question I hope you can keep and ask us later. Yeah, so yeah, this this I think you will all remember this moment when this moment when Bong Joon-ho talk about the 1-inch barrier, and the success of Parasite just before the pandemic. It was quite interesting because I went to see Parasite, and a month later we closed the door, national lockdown. But what he said about he said about this 1-inch barrier, and like really made the Korean film into like international stage. And this is the moment that we decided to write this book, because we thought this is the time. So after we watched the Parasite, and of course this very moving moment, we thought, okay, we're going to write a book. And what happened is, while we're writing the book, Minari got the prize, and many good things happened. And could kind of to the end, when we were just about, when the book was about to come out, so the Squid Game, and I think we so many Korean film and drama and so on, and so much interest in that. And but the thing is, like, there are so many sort of invisibility that we are going to talk about, and there's so many translational variation. And I never experienced people being so interested in translation itself. I mean, very often translation, or language itself, it's something like that, maybe people more who are in Korean studies or learning Korean, they may be interested in. But what I saw last 2 years since the release of Squid Game is that everybody who doesn't know any Korean language is interested in knowing the meanings behind that. What Bong Joon-ho talks about, what is barrier, what is happening behind, what are they talking about? Because they were not very much kind of satisfied by the subtitles itself. And it's sure enough, because when you think about subtitles, it's very much like, you can't say have a footnote about subtitles. You have very much like clear limits in terms of what the characters, but also like you have to be very quick, and you can't, it's something like that, what I call little helper for understanding audio visual images. So it's very much like your little helper. You can't just rely on the entire meaning, particularly when it's contextualized and heavily historical or like a more cultural sensitive, difficult to understand. So then people were asking about different questions about the subtitles. This is right translation and wrong translation. There's a lot of debate in social media in particular, like this is wrong and this is right. And then I was given asked a few times up to comment about the translation, whether this is right translation and wrong translation. And I thought the discussion itself is really interesting, that people are very interested in Korean, what is happening in Korean and English translation. But at the same time, I realized that, translation itself, it's not something you can say, tick the box, this is right translation and this is correct translation and this is wrong translation, because there are so many dimensions in translation, and also so many meanings. And fundamentally, as I will talk about more today, the distance between Korean and English, not like so much straightforward, just between English and French or European languages. So, and of course, Korean, many people think about Korean and like honorifics, politeness, like Koreans use a lot of polite expressions and honorifics and so on. But actually, what I can talk about today, and what we can talk about today, is not so much straightforward. Even Koreans not very much clear when to use which styles, because it's kind of really complex matters. And I'm writing another book called The Modern Polite, and it's not, Koreans are not always polite. If you know Korean people, you would always say, oh, they're not always polite, but it's something that very sort of, difficult, and you have to measure different things, multiple factors. It's not just age, as I will talk about later. Age is very important, but social status and other things are so many things that you have to figure out, measure. But even if your measurement is all correct, still you can get it wrong. So it's what I'm calling it like stylistics, it's almost pragmatic theatrics. So you have to kind of play by the ear all the time, every situation, even if you are talking with the same people in the same situation, still, you have to figure out which style you have to choose. It's almost like going through your wardrobe and to find out the best clothes, which one to wear. It's not always straightforward. You have to figure out many factors to find the best styles. And it's almost the same thing in Korean in terms of like finding the right proper expressions, such as address terms or speech styles, and nonverbal expressions, which are very hardly discussed. But Lori and I are very interested in those nonverbal, such as like nodding. People say Korea is always nodding, and I do it almost instinctively. I know it when I'm talking to people. Also, I don't nod to people if the people, I'm talking to a junior to me. But if they're senior, then I, almost embody these are something that I learned from my young age, is embodied learning. So I instinctively, bodily respond to people who are older than me. So it's the verbal, non-verbal layers of meaning. I use this expression called orchestrating. So it's almost like you have to do the right orchestrating based on the factors, different factors who you are talking to, and so on. And of course, one more thing is negotiation matters. So you have to negotiate whether to kind of, two things. One is whether to make it more intimate, or whether you want to show the respect. So these two things are the main things, but it's tug of war. So which one you use, it really depends on the situation. So you can't tell which one is right all the time. You have to make the judgment based on the situation. So I'm going to show you many examples, but it's so difficult, even to the native speakers, Koreans. I find it still very difficult, and non-Koreans, of course, difficult. But this is very interesting because in many languages, including English, all these sort of more you know, these interactional expressions are frozen. So once you set the relation, you know how to speak. But in Korean, it's not the case. It always changes, and it also depends on the situation. So this is something that also makes Korean and English distance much more, you know, difficult to bridge. And at the same time, this is the reason why translation is almost impossible at times. Yeah. So as I say, like, you know, not just age, of course, age matters so much. So, you know, Koreans secretly ask you, when were you born? When did you go to school? And so on, to figure out the age. But I you know, living in England 20 years, I have sympathy. You know, the reason why Koreans ask you ages is because otherwise they can't tell easily which way to address each other. I mean, you know, there's no set rules, and age gives you a good clue to find out the best way to interact. So I have now sympathy to my Korean friends who try to find out their age secretly. And the gender, rank, intimacy, formality, environment, spectators, network. Spectators, like someone who is, you know, so for example, I'm talking to my mom in a very casual way. I don't use honorifics, you know, very close. But if upstairs lady or my neighbor comes, or even my aunt comes to our house, and I change the way how I speak to my mom. So this is very interesting. Like, you know, everything is same, but if somebody is there, then you have to change. It's almost like I think about, you know, sort of have the analogy of wearing clothes. So with your, you know, people, your comfortable people, you can wear pajamas and, you know, it's okay. But if someone else comes in, you have to change. You can't just wear pajamas. It's a bit like that in Korea and in Korean communication. So if you kind of think about sort of that analogy, it may help you to understand the complexity of Korean language and the interactional dynamics. Before I talk too much, I have a tendency to talk much. So I'll ask Loli to tell us a little bit about this one example, which is found in Pachinko. And Loli, can you just give us a little bit of introduction of Pachinko and explain what it actually you found from this clip?
Yeah, of course. I think I need one slide first. That's it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Okay, so a little bit on Pachinko first, and then I'll explain what this slide's all about. So for those of you who haven't read the book or watched the series, which has been totally amazing, it's basically the story of a Korean girl during the Japanese colonization period, and how she becomes pregnant by one man, and then another man marries her, and it's kind of their story moving to Japan, and then the generations that follow, and how they kind of overcome or continue to face the same difficulties. Just to summarize it, but it's like such a long story with so many different time periods overlapping that I wouldn't be able to do it justice explaining it the whole thing now. So Dr. Kia mentioned before the various pragmatic factors that come into play when working out, you know, how to communicate with each other, and these pragmatic factors influence how polite or not polite certain expressions are, and then based on this, there's an array of meanings that can be interpreted that go beyond, you know, just what you're seeing, that can be quite complex, because when you play with things, twist things, break rules, obviously in certain contexts it means certain things. So one of the politeness classifications that Dr. Kia and I use when the hierarchy isn't clear when there's a conflict. For instance, one person's older, but the other person has higher social status or a more important position, we use the term conflict, because when that happens, using expressions, I mean, Koreans are very sensitive to what expressions are used, because both people hold seniority, and you could if offend either instead of you could offend both instead of just one person. So this results in kind of more interesting meaning potential. And in this slide, the conflicting hierarchy is one of the main characters, who's called Hansu. His father does some accountancy work for a Yakuza gangster, and his father's practically a generation older than this gangster, but the gangster holds higher status, one because he's Japanese, and two because he's a gangster. So there's the fear factor, which is kind of like an additional type of status. And basically what we see here in this conflicting hierarchy is, rather than negotiate power or be considerate of each other, I mean, it's a kind of difficult example because he is Japanese and it's colonization period. So, they're not really going to try to be considerate, I mean, within the context of this story. But the father, when he speaks to this man, I mean, he literally gives up all power from the second he begins talking. He's always leaning and extremely polite. So within the social dynamic, within this conflicting social dynamic, and in the context, what it shows is, the severe fear that he has. And if you watch any Korean film and you see someone who's this old in a conflicting hierarchy behaving in this way, it's usually because they're under, serious threat. Whereas if a junior was doing it, they would be perhaps considered very respectful or polite. So this example is just kind of showing you how that would work, and in the examples that follow, we might be able to show how different meanings come out.
Yes, thank you so much. So so you can maybe we can talk about Pachinko example later again, but thank you, Loli, for your explanation. One thing probably I forgot to mention is this, like verbal and non-verbal orchestrating messages. So very often, like, you can kind of think about this and very easily, like whether it's, like verbal expressions, like what I say or what I act, it has to be in line. So in a way, it's not just like being putting a lot of you or she, like this honorific particles, but you actually have to have the consistency in terms of like what we say and you act. And in a way, the more you use it together in line, you can become more polite and you can show your sincerity. Whereas if you have some kind of mismatch, saying like, you say something like honorific, but if you're not like bowing enough and things like that, that will be also make you very insincere and or sometimes humorous. So those things actually work together as a package. That's why I say about orchestrating those expressions. And I think also the choice of language, for example, like Pachinko really does shows the relation very much. So who is the the both, who is the powerful and who is the powerless, and so on and so forth. Just before going through, I will show you some very, I'm sure some of you may be already very much familiar with Korean language, but as a Korean pragmatist, I will tell you a little bit about Korean language in a not theoretical way. And I'm going to talk about mainly two things, like endings and address terms, the way how you address people. And so basically, this is the cartoon, but look, this is somebody's knocking. This is Korean language. And you want to say, who is it? In English, you can say, who is it? In Korean, you can't do it because you have to figure out, even if you can't see that person or you haven't talked to the person, this is first time, but you need to figure out whether you're talking to a man, adult, or a friend. Unless you know who you're talking to, you can't say. This is the reality of Korean language. Even if this is a very simple situation. And so this is something that, very much so happens in translation too, that in translating Korean film or dramas into English, that part, the interpersonal dynamics, which is so important, and if it's wrongly used, you can have it in all sorts of trouble. I did some another research where actually the wrong use of 반말, casual form between Korean men last 10 years caused multitude of violence and so on. It's not because they do not know Korean language, but it shows how complex and difficult it is to find the right terms, how to address to each other. It's a very serious matter, even to Koreans. And it's, shows, whereas in English, you can just say, who is it? I'll talk about later too, but the first person, second person, you can always, the first person is I in English, no matter who you're talking to or who you are. And the second person is you, and it's so good that you can use you to everyone, even if you're talking to a very senior person. But in Korean, and it's also the case in many Asian languages, that there's no second person pronoun that you can use so easily and so freely, and that is a very big problem in translation too. Koreans, and along with many Asian languages, rely on the context in terms of interpretation, whereas in English, you just have to have a clear pronoun and clear lexical item. So in a way, you have a big gap in translation, which is also in the space of small subtitling space, difficult, impossible to overcome. So what Bong Joon-ho talks about one-inch barrier is in fact almost difficult, impossible barrier to cross. Just few, I don't want to become too theoretical for this talk, so I'll go skip many things, but again, just few key hierarchy matters in Korean. And it's something that somebody asked me, is it the language that makes Korean society hierarchical, or is Korean society hierarchical? Which is which? What is it? I can say one thing is that in 1929, someone linguist called Park Seung-bin this was after Korean sort of Korean Joseon dynasty, and he tried to find something like the equal you to somehow make Korean language less hierarchical, and he wanted to find some ways to respect each other, but the language more equal. And so so he had this kind of idea, and he was working about 10 years. He was a lawyer, but he was working so hard to make Korean language more equal, and so I think if he was successful, he didn't succeed. But if it's successful, perhaps we enjoyed a much more relaxed communication with each other, but it didn't. So as a result, we very, but I don't know whether this is the result of it, or we were, anyway, the society made language hierarchical, or language makes society hierarchical. It's a chicken and egg discussion. The things that also we are going to look at a little bit later is the posture. And though actually in Korean, also when you watch Korean drama and so on, you can quickly get the clue, the relational dynamic, not necessarily because you hear what they say, but because you see what they act. And it's so much like what Lori and I work in this book is basically you can kind of very easily figure out the relations, whether it's who is the senior, who is the junior, who has the power, and who is the powerless, by looking at their different gestures, including the eye contact and your nodding, posture, bowing, and so on and so forth. So these actually make a package of meanings, interpersonal dynamics, more than what you actually hear. So we'll talk a little bit later more, but eye contact is very important. As you may have experience with Korean people, if you look at if you talk, if you look at your partner's eyes straight throughout your talk, they think you're very rude. So in a way, I mean, I find it very difficult sometimes, like when I talk to friends from different places and Korean people in UK, they kind of think I'm staring them, but it's not. So eye contact, who you are looking. Very often, if you are the junior person, you look at somewhere else. Like you are looking at while you are talking to your boss, you're looking at something else. You come back to your boss once in a while, but you don't look at the boss's eyes. And as you can see later in some of the clips, movement is also important. Different hand movement, different posture, all very important. So in a way, Korean people talk about 존댓말 and 반말, which is honorific and hafto, but this is not so simple. Our whole point is that it's not about the verbal, but it's verbal, what you say, what you act, all together orchestrate the meanings, and it has to go in hand to make your meaning very much sincere. And so the difference between 존댓말, 반말 is not so straightforward. And which level you choose is as complicated as your styling, your styling. You think about your own wardrobe and styling, how complex it is. It is how Koreans face each day when you are entering into the Korean language. And again, very simple example, how many ways you can say about thank you and sorry. And it's not about thank you and sorry. When you say thank you and sorry in English, it doesn't show the interpersonal dynamics or hierarchy, you don't know. But in Korean, actually, you can tell by the endings and also, of course, the posture, who is the who has the power, who is the junior, who is the powerless, who is the employed, or also the relation between the two, whether it's close or not. So you can see, just by looking and hearing this very simple expression like sorry and thank you, you can tell beyond what the subtitles can say. In subtitles say thank you, subtitles say sorry, but it's far more than that. And this is one of the examples that I got from the Parasite, and the father talks to Ki-jung, 아들아, 나는 내가 자랑스럽다. Son, I'm very proud of you. This was, I thought it's very interesting because, it was particular tone and the way how he presented it also shows the sincerity and some kind of mutual respect. So this is again like all, these layers of nuanced meanings are not possible in English, but these are kind of the key things that you kind of really figure out what the relationship is between the two. And so as I said again and again, the Korean interpersonal interactional dynamics very rich and very layered. And so what you can get from in English translation or subtitles is very much like very gist of it, but you actually very often don't get what is happening, the nuanced meanings and interactional dynamics. And very often said tug of the war, whether to use 존댓말 or 반말, how to be polite or not, it's not something that you can say, yes, this is based on the calculation, but it's based on how you want to feature yourself, whether you put emphasis on respect or intimacy. And it's again, as I said, it depends on each situation. It is different from in each situation, so it's all different. But what I try to show you here is the hundreds of ways of saying the same things based on this, respect and intimacy, or other aspect you would like to express. And the address terms, let's just talk about address term few minutes, and then we will go on. There are so many ways of address terms. In Oxford English Dictionary last year, we put oppa. I don't know how many of you know the word oppa. And we put oppa, but they also put 언니 and 막내. And in the entire Oxford English Dictionary, the address terms like this, of course, as you may know, many Asian diasporic community has those kinship terms or address terms. They always use it, even if they're speaking in English, they keep these terms, but they haven't entered into the English language dictionary. But the reason why 오빠, 막내, 누나, all these words, suddenly, this is the first instance in Oxford English Dictionary having this many address terms, is as you can imagine, they are all the hard work of K-wave fans who are working and talking and messaging each other very hard. So Oxford English Dictionary uses Twitter corpus as a way to observe the words and the way how the distribution and frequency of words, and they kind of picked up those words. What are these words? And these words are always talked through. 선생님, 사모님, 아줌마, 아저씨, even these words are very frequently used in the Twitter, if you kind of, if you know what I mean. Like K-Wave fandom always talks about these words. And the reason is, if you watch Korean drama, I don't know how many of you are watching Korean drama, but actually, if you watch Korean drama, other words are so much, like long words, some English words you may remember, but these address terms, you hear 100 times. it's something I call embodied learning. So you didn't actually mean to learn Korean language, you didn't mean to learn Korean words, but because these remain when you watch or when you listen, it remains as sound footage. So these words remain, and you know what it means. You know what oppa means. You know what ajumma means, ajoshi means, samonim means, 선생님 means. You know it not because Korean can come and tell you, but you can't. And all this Korean drama helped you to learn those words. So samonim and ajumma. Let me just talk about these two words. And 막내 and oppa, 누나, all these words actually entered into OED, Oxford English Dictionary, because of the fandom. But if I say one more thing, is that the way how oppa or 언니 used to in Korean language is very age-sensitive terms. So oppa means that someone who is older than you, whereas the K-wave fandoms don't use oppa as a way like Koreans. So it's very interesting. Or those Korean origin words or Hallyu words, when they're used in Korea, they were very age-sensitive, hierarchical. But when they're used outside the Korean context, they kind of, this age-sensitive nature becomes less. So I think it's very interesting the way how those words changes. Outside, in English, for example, there's no such age hierarchy. There's a sister, there's one sister. There's no like older sister, younger sister distinction. So, it's kind of natural that those meanings are becoming all blurry. But at the same time, when you have the subtitles, you don't have this, the hierarchical expression. So also in translation too. So in Korean, you hear 언니, but then you have to translate is this. But then the problem is when you translate English into Korean, then it's a problem. It's a trouble because in Korea, you have to decide whether it's older or younger, whereas in English, you only get the sister information. You don't have hierarchical information. So the translator, English to Korean translator, has to make up one or the other. But 사모님 and 아줌마, if I just talk about this one thing, which Lori and I are very, very, very interested in, like, 사모님, 아줌마, not necessarily age difference. Of course, etymologically, 사모님, has more other meaning, 아줌마 has other meaning. But in a way, what is very interesting about Korean language is that these two very similar aged women, but based on what they, how they look. One person looks very luxurious, has a luxurious background, whereas ajumma seems to be very much like ordinary. And in a way, I think it's almost quite cruel that Korean language has different terms for these two womanhood. That no language in the entire world would kind of have different address term based on your wealth. But Koreans can tell you're 사모님 or you're ajumma. It's different. So when I go to luxurious department store, they will call me 사모님. When I go to the market, they will call me ajumma. So, it's all very much like interesting, but it's also, I think it kind of reflects some kind of, the problems in sort of capitalism in South Korea. This again, like, so different, one of the things that we see in the films a lot of times is the different address terms that you use actually does a lot of things. For example, like, when this is Parasite, just to give you a quick intro that she wanted to find some favor from Moon-gwang, and they were in trouble, as you may have remember. And suddenly the first thing she did in order to repair the relationship was that she started calling Moon-gwang 언니. And like, you're my 언니, so, forgive me, things like that. So Koreans, the fastest way to resolve any relational conflict is that, to have some kind of address them, you're 언니, my 언니, which is that you're close to me, you have to forgive me, and I respect you, that sort of thing. So it's very interesting to see those address terms kind of used as a repair strategy, but it's also in Korean language, it's so important to find the right address terms to each other. So I envy you English speakers, have second person pronoun you, and it makes life such so simple, easy. But in Korea, there's so many things you have to think and consider. And of course, for the second person pronoun, the best way of, if you don't know and if you don't want to make risk, the best thing is not to say it. You have to avoid and try to use some sort of non-verbal gestures, but it is very temporary. You need to figure it out, because in order to talk to the person for our time, you need to find the address term, and it's very, very important and difficult matter, whether even if you are Koreans. So I will skip this more theoretical, more sort of wordy parts. But what I try to say in this here is that how difficult it is to translate all these different address terms, because there's not quite right in English. But also, interestingly, many K-wave fandoms or drama fandoms know these words because they always hear it, and they remain as sound footages. And I can tell you that more words, address terms from Korean language will enter into OED in near future. And it's very interesting phenomenon, because no other language has, even if they have all the address terms, no language had entered into OED with so many address terms. It's just Korean address terms all throughout OED. So I thought that's very interesting. And yes, another thing about different gestural bodily words. It's from top to bottom, every part. So like lowering head, eye gaze, and nodding, bowing 15 degrees, 13 degrees. But this is kind of continuum. So you can't just say this means that, this means that. The beauty and the complexity of these nonverbal gestures is you can't just say this means that, this means that. You have to kind of figure out within the context, and the petting and the covering mouth, covering mouth. Maybe I can talk about covering mouth once. Covering mouth for me is the way to kind of show respect to the other person. But I don't know how you, for example, understand covering mouth. So again, like these are very more important, but somehow kind of difficult to understand. Of course, they will not be subtitled, but some English speakers or like non-Korean fandoms would have asked the question, why is she doing this? And there are many gestural what we call meaningful primitives there are, and many more. And the kinship terms, public private space, again, like whether you're talking to private space or public space, all different. I kind of use this knowledge of wearing pajama again. You can wear comfortable clothes if you're in a private space, but you may not wear those clothes if you're in a public space. So I think kind of understanding Korean ways of using, all these different verbal, non-verbal expressions. Think about how you wear, how you style yourself, private, public, all different, who you're talking to, who you are meeting. So I think that maybe help you understand the complexity of it. And as I said, second person pronouns, so rare, and we don't have good ones. So I hope somebody changes language and brings some, more equalized second person pronoun, but more. And because of the time, maybe I will show you some clips, and then you can think about it. These are the clips from Squid Game, or the global Korean fandoms. Yes, and this one I think we can skip. So maybe this was the one that we were talking about, Pachinko, and maybe a few more examples showing sort of non-verbal, because we talk a lot about verbal, but as you see, the way how maybe we can go to this. Non-verbal expressions like bowing, nodding, clasping, and sort of compact posture. How you sit actually also matters. It really shows how you think about yourself within the setting, how you posture, and one hand or two hands. Very much eye gaze, direct or indirect gaze, turn taking, and silence. Silence very often considered as a virtue, whereas the silence in other contexts, cultural contexts, could be considered as indifference, but in Korean context, often virtue. And covering the mouth with hands, scratching one's head, waving. Very often, this is English way of waving. Korean waving is nodding. So, these two, equal or like hierarchical. So these are all sort of non-verbal expressions and many more. But what's very interesting is that because Korea become all very much multilingual, multicultural. Koreans very often said, we are homogeneous, so. But now Korean, sort of all over the place, K-wave fandom and people living in Korea and Korean diaspora. So nonverbal expressions are becoming very much diverse. So you can't just say this is Korean, it's non-Korean. It has a very interesting in-depth repertoire right now, but very much like typical Korean situation. You can see also how much you bow also shows your relational dynamic between you and your partner. Slight bow, salute, respectful bow, and so on. And you can see like how you give even money or things like that. So your gesture itself, even a very simple act like giving, it shows the seniority very much. The emoji speaks, and emoji says the relational dynamics, which the text doesn't speak. Text will just give you very much like helping information, but then all these images will speak the nuanced invisible meanings. And here again, like you can see whether they're equal, for example, in taxi driver, or like whether it's a senior or junior, how you use one hand or two hands, and so on. It's a one hand and two hands, you can see. Of course, what I'm saying, we're talking about today, is not like this is the rule. As I said, it's a theatrics. All the time it changes. All the time you have to play by the ear. But there's also in danger in doing that, because if you can get it wrong. So there's no habit or routine that you can use. It has to be always adapted to tailor-made in the situation. So this is the difficulty, I think, in Korean communication. Because of time, I just show you two more, like junior, senior, very kind of, this is sort of very typical, but it's exaggerated. Not every kid in Korea show respect like this to the teacher and so on. But we can very easily, in a very nuanced way, can tell the relational dynamic, who is junior, who is senior, what is their relationship like, eye posture, and who kind of eye gaze, posture. You can see very much like who is under the power, who has the authority and power, and so on. So our book, which we published last year, is basically talking about the stories of verbal and non-verbal interactions through the Korean film and drama. It's something that subtitles cannot tell, and the translations, of course, can't tell, literal translation. But there's so much enriched meanings in what you can see, and this is very much so. I think it's the game of playing, learning who has the power, who does not have power, what their relationship is like, close, unclose, the interpersonal dynamics, and so on. These are something that, again, when I talk about back to Bong Joon-ho's 1-inch barrier, this is difficult to verbally overcome. And I think this is something that non-verbal images and other things, cultural knowledge, will help us to overcome. But I think the verbally, that will be impossible to overcome. And it makes us to think about the translation all together. Is it just about language? And it's just something that the words, and you can see there's words, but also words can go beyond what we see as the characters and letters, and so on. Thank you so much for listening. And this is all in the book. And as I said, I'm doing another book called More Than Polite to show this interplay and interpersonal dynamics. And so let me know if you have any questions, but this is very much the end of our talk. And any questions, please ask me and Lori. Thank you so much.